This video is about the purpose and content of the risk profile. The point of the risk profile is really quite simple. Risk analysis is evidence-based decision making. The purpose of the risk profile is to find out what evidence is available at the outset of a risk management activity. So you would ask things such as, what do we already know about the problems that we have identified? What do others already know? So if you gather the information that you already know and that others already know, is that enough information to make a decision? When you are doing risk management, you don't have to do a risk assessment for every decision, for every situation. If you can gather the information that you have, and you have enough information to answer the questions that you need to know how to achieve your objectives and to solve the problems, then you're ready to go. You don't need a risk assessment. But if there are significant uncertainties remaining and you need more information, then the risk profile step is going to indicate that you do indeed need a risk assessment. So building on that idea, we can define two very distinct roles for a risk profile. One is when you don't know if you're going to need a risk assessment or not because you haven't investigated the available information. When you gather the information that's available, you may reduce your uncertainty enough to be confident about the action that you want to take. In other cases, you'll gather the information that's available and realize that the uncertainty is still significant and you're going to need more information. So one role for risk profile is to help us to learn whether we need to do a risk assessment or not. Other times, you know from the outset that you're going to do a risk assessment. You know that you're going to need a risk assessment. Even when you know this, the first step is to gather the available data. And so in this role, the risk profile actually performs the function of a preliminary or a draft risk assessment. In the past, I've done some work for the government on risk assessments that were actually very large. And the risk profile step has functioned essentially as an opportunity to find out, do we even have enough information to complete a risk assessment? So the risk profile can fulfill either of these two roles. So a risk profile is basically gathering the available information. I don't know what kind of mind picture that gives you, so let's consider what a risk profile can really look like. If you have very limited time, it could be as simple as you ordering your thoughts when you have to act quickly. What do you know about this situation? What are the uncertainties? What are your options? What are you going to do? So a risk profile can be that quick. It could be a meeting with the people who are available when a problem arises. So if you happen to have one of those problems that kicks down your door on a Friday afternoon and you gather your staff together in the conference room for 30 minutes to share ideas and thoughts about what's going on, that can function as a risk profile. The 3 pieces of paper that you develop as part of the risk management activity could be your risk profile. There are other extents that you can go in a risk profile as well. A literature review could be a very effective way to complete a risk profile. In some instances, you might prepare a white paper or a status report. Some problems might require a more formal and complete research paper. And then there are some communities of practice, like the food safety community, for example, where a risk profile is a very formal document. So this step of gathering the available data, it can span many things, from you just taking a moment or two to clarify your thoughts, all the way through a formal document. The nice thing about a risk profile is it's a flexible concept, and it's perfectly expandable. If you've got 5 minutes to solve a problem, the risk profile step becomes very brief. If you have a year or two, it can be much more expansive. The purpose of a risk profile is to frame a problem or an opportunity in a risk context and to provide as much of the available information as possible in order to guide the risk assessment as well as risk management and risk communication activities. The conduct of a risk profile is the risk manager's responsibility. The risk managers don't have to be the ones who actually do it. In many cases, they won't have the skills or knowledge available to do this. That might have to come from risk assessors and other members of the staff, but it is the risk managers to see that it is done. And it is not unheard of for risk managers to complete the risk profile on their own. In best practice, risk managers should at least consult with risk assessors. If they do a risk profile on their own, they should check and make sure that they've gathered all the readily available information and have current knowledge. Ideally, a risk profile would involve stakeholders, but that's done less frequently in practice. Whether you've got 15 minutes to complete a profile or a year and a half, it can be helpful to consider the parts of the profile that might be useful in conducting your assessment, management, and communication activities. So here I list 6 categories, and we'll talk about each one. There's administrative information, problem formulation information, direction setting, risk management measures, risk communication, and scoping the risk assessment. We'll consider each of these. When establishing the risk context for the problem that you're dealing with, there's going to be some administrative information that will always be important. This would include the team, resources, and schedules. You may have to think about the structure of the risk analysis team. Who are the people who are going to participate in this particular risk profile and risk assessment activity? Are there key personnel that you need? Are some of them from outside your organization? What different roles and responsibilities will people in different offices play? Coordinating the responsibilities for risks that span several stovepipes or functions within your organizations is often an important step. Resources refers to not only personnel, but to laboratories, computers, office space, and other such things. Schedules will be important. When is the work to be completed? And there may be some other basic understandings that have to be worked out between risk managers and risk assessors. There are problem identification elements of the risk profile. This is where your initial statement of the problems and opportunities would actually appear. So those pieces of paper that we talked about before, if you're interested in where their home would be, it would be as part of the risk profile. But the risk profile goes beyond that simple listing of bullets, and the risk profile is where you would begin to build the detailed descriptions of the problems and the opportunities. This would include describing the values potentially at risk, perhaps human health, economic values, cultural assets, or other asset values. This is where you would pull those out into considerable detail so that people can understand the problems and opportunities as completely as is possible at this point in time before you would begin a formal risk assessment. Helping to set a direction for your risk analysis activity is another important function of this risk profile. So the directional risk profile elements accomplish this. This is where your objectives and constraints come into play. Identify the objectives and the constraints in your risk analysis activity. Including a statement of the intended use of the risk assessment is important, especially at a government level. Some risk assessments are intended to guide research, others form the basis for new rules and regulations, some are trying to attribute risk to different hazards, and so whatever the potential uses of the risk assessment are, they need to be identified here in the risk profile. In these directional elements, you would include that third piece of paper, the set of written questions to be answered by the risk assessment. So our 3 pieces of paper actually become very much a part of the core of the risk profile. In the risk profile, it would be important to capture as much as we know about the different means by which people were trying to manage these risks already. So the management measures elements of the risk profile would include the characteristics of the risk that might affect risk management options. If human health is affected, we might be involving public health and medicine and other kinds of measures from those fields. If the environment is going to be affected, we might be looking at an entirely different kind of tool set. The known risk management characteristics of the producer of the risk and the bearer of the risk are important as well. Once again, if I use my food safety background, if the company that is producing the commodity that is of potential concern has a good track record, has risk management measures in place, that's going to be useful and much more important to know. In the same way, the people who bear the risk, the people who buy that commodity, do they prepare it as the directions indicate? Or is it possible that people are subjecting the commodities to time and temperature abuse that might be increasing the risk? So whatever the risk is, it's important to know how the people who produce the risk take measures, if any, to reduce it, and how the people who bear the risk might take measures that would either increase or decrease the risk. It's useful to know what the current risk management practices relevant to your issue are. What is best practice in the industry? What is best practice for the problems that you're looking at? This piece of the risk profile would usefully conclude with a list of the various priorities for risk management purposes. If the top priority is international trade, if the top priority is profit or the bottom line, if the top priority is cost cutting or preserving the public health, preserving environmental values, these would all be important things to identify early on in the process as we're framing the problem and our approach to it. Risk communication elements are often omitted in risk profiles, but they shouldn't be. It would be important to consider the distribution of the risk, perceptions of the risk, any international agreements that might come into play, and stakeholders. So when we talk about the distribution of the risk in the risk profile, it would be important to know who's producing the risk, who benefits from this risky situation, and who bears the risk. But inasmuch as we're talking about risk communication now, it would be important to try to identify these people, because that would constitute our preliminary identification of stakeholders. To the extent that you are able to identify public perceptions of the risk, do the people who are affected by the risk perceive the risk in a way that is well aligned with what the scientists would say about the risk, or is there a strong social or emotional context to this risk? And then, of course, any international agreements that could affect the risk issue at all would be important to identify here. The preceding tasks that I've been speaking about would actually help you gather quite an impressive amount of information, evidence, and data. But the primary focus of this last piece, scoping out the assessment steps, this is where most of the data collection gets done. Ideally, the risk profile would include a conceptual risk model. We'll be learning more about those when we get to the risk assessment courses. But right now, let's just say that the conceptual risk model would tell us what could go wrong, how it could happen at a conceptual level. There would be very often a preliminary or a qualitative risk assessment. So if you've got some data, you might actually do the first iteration of a risk assessment in a risk profile, and one reason for doing that is to identify important data gaps. Very often you will find that there is not enough information yet available to even complete a risk assessment. And that's very important to know before launching a formal risk assessment, because sometimes it's necessary to do some research. You might have to pause for a few months or even a couple of years in some cases to do some directed research to fill the critical data gaps that are necessary to enable you to complete a risk assessment. After you do this assessment scoping, this is where risk managers, using the information in the risk profile, would make a decision whether or not to pursue a full risk assessment. And if they decide to, this is also where the risk managers would decide whether that risk assessment will be a qualitative one or a quantitative one.